All right, welcome to an Integrated Spine Solutions Live. We are talking today stooped posture versus neutral posture, and I'm going to do my very best to highlight some of the most important aspects of what we are looking at when we talk about what's safer, what's more appropriate, what are the current biomechanical studies show to help inform rehab professionals. And the neutral spine during lifting movements is the more dominant clinical um, preference, and that is what's taught. But there is a case for flexion, and what I want to do today is just show both sides of that. I know sometimes I will talk about, in some cases, lifting with a flex spine shouldn't really be a fearful movement, but in many cases, and you'll hear me say a lot of the time, it really depends, which is the kind of the more annoying thing about being um, online and sharing, opinions and things like that, and trying to just educate as best we can. So I'm just going to post this real quick. In this is the fun part, just being totally prepared. Stooped. Let's try this again. I'm gonna do link. Okay. Okay. So here is the quick and dirty rundown of the argument for stooped posture lifting and a neutral spine. So I think one of the first pictures I've showed is if you look at any type of OSHA placard or any type of OSHA best practices for protecting your spine at work, you'll see someone with a stooped posture, meaning they're standing all the way up, their hips are flexed, and they're reaching towards the floor. And you'll see somebody with like a squat where their spine's a little bit more rigid and neutral, and you'll see that there's an X over the stooped position. Well, I'm going to just break down the two different ways that we can look at this. So, biomechanics research right now suggests that a neutral spine is a position that helps avoid disc injury. It offers a greater compressive strength, meaning you can lift more, reducing your injury risk from an anterior shear at the spine, and ideally promotes a hip dominant movement, making it, better for performance, but also that injury prevention, like I mentioned. While flexion is often an unavoidable movement of the spine that you can find in daily life, in sport, and research suggests that it can be metabolically efficient. So anytime you're moving a joint through its full range of motion, it's overall going to be a healthier joint. That sometimes it can be even protective, maybe, and as the body adapts to repeated flexion and loading without directly correlating to damage with pain. So you can get adaptations through movement of a joint, right? Well, research also suggests that a neutral spine tends to be safer when avoiding that disc herniation, like I said, but especially under repeated flexion and compression. So, there is caution while trying to avoid creating a fear of flexion. There does seem to be biomechanically some advantages to that neutral spine, like I'm mentioning, but um, that fear of flexion can create heightened sensitivity, and it can negatively impact outcomes, especially if you're having pain, right? So we'll get to that towards the end about what you do with pain and neutral or pain and flexion. But I think it's important to recognize too that while lifting with a flex spine increases the anterior shear forces, which along with cumulative compressive loading is associated with higher risk injury, it is important to know that there's no research showing that a flex spine is technically stronger either. So this is still the argument for a neutral spine. So this is where that argument comes when people start lifting with Jefferson curls, and you can see how there are people that might say, well, I'm just going to lift some weights under some spinal load. Well, just like I've done it, I know that there are people online who do well with it, not talking about pain or injury, but just talking about what the research says, that there isn't any good biomechanical research that says that a flex spine is technically a stronger position when lifting for performance, right? So making the argument for neutral spine because of that greater like hip dominant strategy. Okay. So this is where things start to get a little interesting is as we start to think about the research for flexion of the spine during lifting, there's research that shows that disc herniations can still occur in a neutral spine position when lifting, and that overall a neutral spine is not more protective from other injuries aside from disc herniations. So if you have found that you're maybe at an equal risk when it comes to just normal day-to-day movements or even lifting, can you really start to purport or support it, one strategy over another? And that's where it kind of gets individualized, which we can talk about in just a moment. But there are biomechanical studies that actually found less anterior shearing with lifting with that stoop or flex posture as opposed to squatting. So at the beginning, I mentioned picking up the box in a squat position with the neutral spine or stooped posture. Well, what's frustrating about biomechanical research is they really want to disprove themselves. And so you'll see studies actually showing less shear forces in a stooped position, and you'll find studies that show less shear forces, anterior shear forces to be exact on both cases for a neutral spine. So that's the interesting part. And so the question I kind of think is like, how much control over avoiding disc injuries do we actually have? And should disc herniations be our biggest concern? If you look at, McGill's work, um, and many of the other biomechanical studies that help us sort of lead the more popular clinical opinion of a neutral spine, which I do agree with, that it being, a neutral spine being more safer when it comes to preventing disc herniations. If you look at the percent of incidence for disc herniations among all back pain cases, it only amounts to about 2 to 5% of all back pain cases. So if a neutral spine is not any more safer at preventing disc herniations than a flexed position during day-to-day movements, we can start to have some final thoughts and comments about when does this matter. So another component that I find that's really interesting, that if we just look at biomechanics, we can see all this data, right? We're looking at statistics, we're looking at probability and chances of injury or anything like that. And it's not totally preventable. The other thing is if you take a step back and come at it from a different angle that I talk about often, which is pain and damage are very poorly linked. So disc herniations exist in asymptomatic populations, right? The body also adapts to the stress that's put on it. So in the rehab context, it's helpful if you can be progressive over time. And I don't mean 6 weeks. A lot of times 6 weeks PT is the recommendation. And when people aren't seeing dramatic results or even a little bit of progress, they might be throwing in the towel a little bit early. But, ideally working with a rehab provider for 6 to 9 months, progressing, having the body adapt to certain stress. Because we know that in certain spinal flex positions, you can have adaptations. And again, coming back to a joint that moves through a full range of motion, that is, in my opinion, ideal. It's going to be metabolically efficient, the thing that's most healthy for a joint. So instead of focusing on maybe a neutral spine all the time or maintaining that for fear of preventing injury or fear of having injury, so you're trying to prevent it, it might be better to focus on the goals that you're trying to have and how it relates to movement, but also any symptoms, and go from there. Like determine the movement strategies you have after that. So experimenting with spinal flexion with everyday activities as opposed to being stiff and rigid all the time, and attempting to reduce the overall fear of flexion with things like tying your shoes or making your bed or sitting. And if you're having problems with flexion, it's probably an obvious solution for you temporarily, hopefully, is that you're avoiding flexion. And that is a good strategy, and that's okay. I would argue that it's good to do that temporarily and not permanently. So if you're lifting for max weight, you're in the gym, you're feeling good, you're not in a rehab kind of setting, but even if you are having pain, it could be a good idea for performance to keep that neutral spine and having that more hip dominant strategy. And this kind of comes back to the point that there's no current evidence showing that lifting with a flex spine is technically safer, despite being no worse at increasing the risk for disc herniations. So I know that was a lot kind of thrown at you. Hopefully it makes sense. In an effort to not recap the entire thing, we essentially had the biomechanical argument for uh, avoiding a flexed spine during lifting uh, because it creates a higher risk for disc herniation. Then you have a flexed spine, which is largely unavoidable. I didn't even touch on how much of the spine is actually flexing, even with a neutral spine that you can see with the naked eye. And then looking at the flexed spine, right, being unavoidable, but also having studies that show there is just as much or more shear forces at the spine when you stoop, or when you as rather excuse me when you squat with a neutral spine. So with disc herniations possibly being something that may not even be avoidable altogether because you find them equally in both spine positions, it's probably better to focus on symptoms and your goals. And that I just summarized. So hopefully this was helpful. Please subscribe if you found this interesting. And if you're in the integrated spine solutions community, please leave a comment if you have further questions, and I'll send you some of my responses there if this even made sense at all. Hopefully it did. So I